Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 338 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Dale Bailey. He's the author of the novels The Fallen, House of Bones, Subterranean Season, and Sleeping Policemen, which he wrote with Jack Slade Jr., as well as the short story collection The Resurrection Man's Legacy and Other Stories. His short fiction has won the Shirley Jackson Award and the International Horror Guild Award, and been nominated for the Nebula and Bram Stoker Awards. And we'll be speaking with him today about his new novel In the Nightwood, which was edited by our producer John Joseph Adams, and about his most recent short story collection, The End of Everything. And now here's our interview with Dale Bailey. All right, so we're here with Dale Bailey. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Okay, so in your story, The Blue Hole, it says, "That was the summer I turned 13, the summer I smoked pot for the first time, the summer I fell in love with movies and science fiction and rock and roll." And I was just curious if that was autobiographical at all, if you ever had a summer like that.
I did. I don't know that it was when I was 13. Times are kind of hazy at this point in my life. But yeah, it was early in my adolescence. I fell very much in love with those things, and that kid in that story who was, buying paperback books off the spinner rack in the drugstore and listening to The Clash is very much me. So yeah.
I mean, was there a particular moment that you first discovered it? Did somebody hand you a book, or did you come across a book, or what happened?
I actually came to science fiction well before I came to the other things, to pot and to
rock and roll.
Yeah, no kidding, to rock and roll. My father handed me The Hobbit when I was just barely able to read The Hobbit, so I must have been, in second grade or something. So able to comprehend it at only the most basic level. And I read that, and I moved on to reading the Narnia books, and from there I discovered the science fiction section in the local library. And I read my way through just about everything they had, and then I started over again and read it a second time.
Wow. So was your dad a big science fiction fan then?
My dad wasn't. My dad was a college professor, and he had, he started teaching in the 60s when Tolkien really took off. And I think he came to Tolkien that way. So he was more of a Tolkien, of a Tolkien fan than a real science fiction fan. But he encouraged my interests a lot. He took me to see Star Wars maybe 30 times, I think, when it first came out. So he encouraged my interests a lot. He let me stay up and watch Hammer horror movies on the late movie when they used to have the late movie. So I came to a lot of this stuff early, and I guess it came together in my adolescence, and it became, central to my identity in some ways.
So was your dad an English professor or something else?
He was an English professor. My mother was an English teacher, and my father was an English professor. And the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I, in my day job, am an English professor, and my wife is a high school English teacher. So
Wow.
There you go. My daughter is an English major. So it runs in the family, I guess.
Yeah, and so did they look down on fantasy and science fiction at all as English professors?
No, not at all. Not at all. I've run into that kind of prejudice, bias, what have you, obviously in my career, but my parents certainly did not. In fact, my father had a colleague who was also interested in science fiction, and he was trying to build the science fiction collection in the college library, and I became his unofficial consultant, suggesting he buy the latest Philip K. Dick or what have you. So it was not looked down upon at all.
That's when you were a kid or a teenager?
Yeah, I guess I must have been, 12-ish, 13-ish, the same age, I guess, as the kid in the blue hole.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was very much my life at that point. I suspect this is true of a lot of writers in the genre, but it's kind of an outsider. I didn't have a lot of social connections, and that world just gave me a place to go, and that was very welcoming to me.
So you didn't have any other friends who were interested in fantasy and science fiction?
I can't think of a single one. Those connections came later on as I grew up, but I was very isolated in that respect. I lived off the library books, the books I got at the local drugstore, and the movies that came, to the theater, Star Wars, and things like that. But beyond that, I really had no connections to the field. I knew nothing about fandom, even that it existed. And I knew very little about the science fiction magazines that were, then so important to the genre, until my father started subscribing me to them. And then I got those regularly as well.
I mean, the character in the story is reading Starlog magazine. Did you ever read Starlog?
Oh yeah, I had a subscription to Starlog for many years. Starlog had a column. Starlog had a column devoted to amateur fiction, and I sold. That's the wrong word. Since they didn't pay any money, I placed a story there. When I was 1979, 80, something like that. I would have been around 12 years old. Shortly after Star Wars came out, and I remember I got the letter saying that I'd placed the story, and my sister, who is 3 or 4 years older than me, came in the door, and I'm very excited, and I'm showing her the letter, and she said, "Are you getting paid for it?" And I said, "No." And she goes, "Talk to me when you get paid." That was my sister. But yeah, I remember discovering Starlog at a local convenience store. It had a picture of an X-Wing fighter on the cover, and I thought, I've got to have that. And so I subscribed shortly after that.
And so that story that you placed there, that was the first thing that you had that appeared anywhere?
Well, actually, that's the second part of the story, which I should have mentioned is. So I was very excited about this, and I got a letter about a month or two afterwards saying they had canceled the column.
Oh no!
So my first my first placement of a story was revoked, unfortunately.
So did you have anything else around there, or did you have to wait 10 years before something else appeared?
I went to Clarion in about 1992, and I was, 20, how old was I in 1922? 24 years old, I guess. And I sold a story while I was at Clarion. One of my teachers was Chris Rush at Fantasy and Science Fiction, the editor then. And she bought one of the stories that I had written at Clarion. So that was when things finally started getting into print.
So what story was that?
It's a story called Idleman's Machine. I don't think it's been reprinted but one time. So it's long lost to history now. It never appeared in a collection or anything like that.
I mean, did it express, would you say, some of the same concerns that you have now, or have you shifted a lot from that early story?
That early story was about fathers and sons, and if you read through the first collection of stories I published called The Resurrection Man's Legacy, you would be perhaps struck by how many stories were about fathers and sons, how many stories were about southern West Virginia, where I grew up, and I think I sort of exhausted that material, about the time 2001 came around, and I moved on to other things.
I mean, you mentioned that. So in this this collection, the end of everything, you say in the sort of the acknowledgments or the afterword that you had sort of about a 6-year period of writer's block, right? Was that around that time?
It happened around 2002, 2003. I was in graduate school, or I'd just gotten out of graduate school and started my first teaching job. And for that reason, I had a lot on my plate, and that was one of the reasons I turned away from writing. And then I had some health problems that very much occupied my time, and I just didn't get back to it until around 2010. So the stories in that collection, the end of everything, were all, with a couple of exceptions, written 2010 and later, and I think most of them in 2012 and 13 and after that.
So were you still having ideas for stories that you wanted to write and you just were overwhelmed by other things, or were you just not having ideas that excited you?
I was, I wasn't even thinking about trying to have ideas at the time. I am, perhaps this is oversharing, but it's no secret. I'm bipolar, and I was just very much concerned with trying to pull myself together, and as a consequence, just trying to hold my life together was about all I could do. And I finally was properly treated, and then I found myself drawn back to writing. If you look at the acknowledgments, you'll see a reference to Dr. Sin. I think is Jay Sin is his name, and sort of bringing me back into the light. I said in the acknowledgments, and he was the guy who really found a way to a medication regimen that worked enough for me to get back to a normal life.
Well, that's great. And so then what was that process of starting to write again? Like, what was the first story that you wrote coming out of that?
I don't know that I can answer this definitively, but there was a story called The Crevasse, which I wrote with Nathan Ballingrud. And Ellen Datlow had invited us independently to submit a story to this anthology called Lovecraft Unbound. And Nathan was visiting right before the deadline. I mean, a day or two before the deadline, and neither one of us had started writing anything. And we were sitting on the back deck drinking beer, and I said, "Do you have anything?" And he goes, "I have nothing." And I said, "I have nothing either." Of course, I hadn't had anything for several years at that point. And we started talking. We ended up going down to my office in the basement, and I started writing this story, The Crevasse, with just a bare inkling of where it might be going. And I remember I got 2 or 3 paragraphs in, and Nathan said, "You're good. You still got it." So that was very encouraging. So we spent the night taking turns at the typewriter or the computer, I guess. That shows my age. Just rotating through the story until we had finished the story, by the next morning. And I think that was the first story I wrote when I sort of came out of that very dark period, which is, it's a pretty dark story, actually.
And how long is that story?
It's just about 4,000 or 5,000 words. It's not a real long story. I don't think we could have written much more than that in that space of 10 or 12 hours. And then we asked Ellen for a day or two, as I recall, to polish it up, and then we sent it in, and she took it.
I mean, still, 4,000 or 5,000 words in one night is that's a pretty good night.
That's an amazing night for me. I'm lucky if I can write 1,000 words in 4 or 5 hours at the computer. So I think part of it was the sort of spurring each other on was part of it, and that 4,000 or 5,000 words, of course, was split. Right, I didn't write the whole thing, so I guess I wrote about 2,000 words of it. I remember we got to a point and I was writing a scene and what was supposed to be the final scene, and I looked back at what Nathan had just written, and I said, wait, this is the final scene, not what I'm writing now. So we just cut that last scene that I was working on off the story, and that was how we wound up with the ending of the story.
Because I saw you say elsewhere that you usually spend a couple months on each story.
I do. I can count on the on 2 or 3 fingers the number of stories that have been written at speed. I write very slowly, and the one other exception I can think of is right after the World Science Fiction Convention in Philadelphia, right around 2000 or so. And my plane home was delayed by 12 hours or something absurd like that. So I bought a notebook and started writing just to fill the time. And by the time my plane landed, I had the story in place. So other than that, it's a kind of a grueling process for me.
Was that story that you wrote on the plane, has that appeared anywhere?
Yeah, Ellen Datlow bought that too. It's called... No, wait, I'm confused. Gordon Van Gelder bought that story for fantasy and science fiction, and then Ellen later reprinted it. It's called Hunger, A Confession. And Ellen reprinted it, and then John Joseph Adams reprinted it in Nightmare. So it's hanging out there in the world of the internet if you want to see it.
So going back to Nathan Ballenkruid for a second, so how did you know him, and how did it come that he was staying at your house?
We were roommates at Clarion back in '92, and that was by chance. I was living in Tennessee. He was living in North Carolina, and he called me up. We had gotten each other's names and numbers, and he called me up and said, "Do you want to ride up with me?" And so he came and got me, and we drove up to Michigan State together, overnight. I forget how long it was. It took forever, it seemed like. And we talked the whole way, and then we got there and we found out that we were roommates, and we clicked. Nathan and I have there was a brief interregnum of a few years when Nathan left writing himself, and he was living in New Orleans then, and we kind of fell out of touch. But then we reconnected in the late '90s, and we've been just very close friends ever since. I think rarely does a day pass that Nathan and I aren't in touch with one another through texting, if nothing else.
Well, so have you ever collaborated on anything else?
We have not. We have tried. We have talked about it. I think what has happened is that first experience occurred under such a pressure situation that it was a little easier for us to do. And it's a fairly simple story, but I think our aesthetics have drifted a bit. And, I think also we both want ownership in a way that makes it hard for us to share. Not that there has been, any tension or anything like that. It's just we'll start talking about something And, a few hours into the conversation, we'll reach a point where I want to go in one direction and Nathan wants to go in another. And so we go in our separate directions.
Yeah.
But those are great conversations. I always enjoy talking about the stories we should collaborate on, but we can't for some reason.
So you talk out your ideas with each other, and then you go off and write them separately?
That often happens. Nathan is one of the few people who sees things that I write in draft, and we talk a lot about what we're working on. That we don't necessarily always talk through every story, but we're pretty much, always aware of what the other one is working on, and we certainly do talk about what's working and what's not. It's a lot of griping. I can't get this to work, we'll say, but we always seem to make it work somehow or other.
I think it's interesting because in one of these stories, there's an artist character, and she has what she calls the tea kettle theory, which is basically if you talk about something, some work in progress, you'll never do it because you get all the pressure out just by talking about it. So do you not subscribe then to the tea kettle theory?
Well, that's a complicated answer because I do subscribe to the tea kettle theory, but for some reason Nathan is the exception to the rule. Our minds just seem to move in the same channels when we talk about stories. But yeah, I don't generally talk about works in progress simply because I don't know what they're going to turn out to be yet, and I also I find that it does relieve that pressure. It's like outlining something or writing a proposal, and in some cases that sort of makes it feel like it's already done. So can you subscribe to a theory and not subscribe to a theory at the same time? But is that possible?
Okay, so one of the stories that I enjoyed most of all out of this book that I really wanted to ask you about is called Lightning Jack's Last Ride. Could you just talk about what that story is about and how you came up with the idea?
Sure. Lightning Jack's Last Ride is a title that occurred to me many years ago before it was written. I think I first got the title in the late 90s. Where the title came from, I don't know. A lot of stories suggest themselves to me as titles, and the process of figuring out what that title is really about is the unfolding of the story itself. So I took several different stabs at Lightning Jack's Last Ride, and finally I happened upon the idea of a race car driver who is unable to race anymore, and it was there it was just a matter from there of what are the circumstances that prevent him from doing it, the thing he loves, and so it was a matter of inventing the world around this character. One of the things I enjoyed most about that character is the narrator's voice. He's an observer of Lightning Jack. Lightning Jack is only seen from the outside by this first-person speaker, and I enjoyed discovering that speaker's voice a great deal.
Right, so you have this race car driver, and the reason that he can't race is because it's in this dystopian peak oil future, and oil has become so scarce that it's sort of only used by the military, basically. And just talk about creating, and so the character, he turns to highway robbery, sort of knocking over these oil tankers, so they can keep racing.
Right, and then there's this sort of underground racing world. And I think, the other influence on the story was very much, I had been thinking and reading about, criminals from the these criminal gangs in the 1920s, gosh, I can't think of a name right off the top of my head, but I've been thinking about those larger than life personalities of these criminals in the 20s, and I wanted to create a larger than life personality like that. So it's like I took Babyface Nelson, there's a name, and or someone of his ilk, and set him into this racing world. So I was interested in writing about this character, Lightning Jack, and I was reading about and thinking about these characters. I guess they were actually during the Depression in the 30s, and those two sort of coincided to create the story.
I mean, how much of the world building did you do before you started writing it? Because I guess you had to figure out some reason why, highway robbery would come back in the future.
Yeah, the story was very drafty, by which I mean, it went through a lot of iterations as I did the world building. I almost never sort of figure out the world before I start writing. It's more like a process of discovering the world and then sort of refining the world through the actual process of putting the piece together. So things sort of occur to me as I go, and then there's a recursive process where I'm going back to fix the early parts of the story so they match the world building that has occurred as I continue to move forward. So my process is very much that kind of recursive process. And I hear writers talk about, well, I've done my first draft, I'm going to go back and do my second draft. And I understand that theoretically, I suppose, but because I'm always, inching forward and then going back and working on what I've done, by the time I reach the end of a piece, it feels very much like I've reached the end of the piece. I mean, there are a couple of exceptions, but generally that's the way it works for me.
Right. So, for example, you had to dream up, I guess, that the air is so polluted that satellite surveillance and fighter jets and things aren't really practical now, to make it possible to,
right.
capture a tanker.
I had to get rid of airplanes. Fighter jets would render the whole story impossible. And in no way am I a hard science fiction writer, as you, if you've read through the collection, know. But so that was a piece of window dressing. I don't know if actually air could get that polluted that planes couldn't fly. I suppose it's possible, but anyway, it was the window dressing I needed to make the story work. And I think you need just enough of that kind of window dressing to enable the reader to accept the world of the story while she's reading it. I think of the Samuel Taylor Coleridge quote about suspending your disbelief, and that's what I was trying to do in that, with the airplanes and the satellites being unable to function, is just provide enough background or enough explanation that the reader could find a way to buy into the story, and I hope it worked.
Well, one of the world-building details is that the United States has fractured after Washington, D.C. was destroyed by the NRA with a dirty bomb. Is that some political commentary there?
Well, I guess I have to cop to that. Yeah, it is. I think it is. It speaks to my concern about the violent nature of our country, certainly, and domestic terrorism, and And while I, don't and wouldn't in reality perhaps equate the NRA with a terrorist organization, again, it was just a way to move the story forward. But I wrote another story called Death and Suffrage, which appears in my first collection, which is very much about, about guns and how they function in our culture, and my concerns about that, which have become exacerbated as we, have mass shooting after mass shooting. I teach at a college. My wife teaches high school, and these are often sites where these things occur. I think about these things.
I mean, so on the cover of the book, there's a quote from James Patrick Kelly, and he says, "Dale Bailey is the poet of the apocalypse." I was curious what you thought about that.
Jim was one of my teachers at Clarion. I've known him for years. I hope that that's, I hope that that is true, at least of the book. It was certainly very flattering to receive that blurb. I'll have to let Jim in the end, have the last word on that. I don't know that I would claim personally to be a poet of the apocalypse or perhaps of anything else.
But you do write a lot about the apocalypse. I mean, there's 2 stories about the end of the world, and this is a dystopian story.
Right. Well, I guess there's the end of everything is kind of it's definitely an end of the world story. The opening story in the book is the end of the world as we know it, which is obviously an end of the world story. So that kind of, those stories bookend the collection, and I think speak to the general tenor of the collection, which is, it's a dark book, and I think, those stories sort of set the tone of the book, and Lightning Jack is sort of toward the middle, and it's a story about the world unwinding as well. It feels to me in this particular historical moment that the world is unwinding, and I think the stories just reflect where I was coming from, the environment I was living in when I wrote them. Which is to say, I mean, they're not conscious statements. I don't think of myself as a political commentator or anything like that. It's just, rather they just grow out of a sense of, that the culture is in a dark place, and so these are the stories that emerge, rather than me coming up with a story to express a political point of view. That these are just the ones that come out because of the cultural environment I find myself in.
Right. So in the story, The End of the World as We Know It, it's a very self-aware end of the world story where there's sections talking about, in end of the world stories, it always happens like this, or it usually happens like that. Could you talk about why you wanted to tell the story in that way?
That was a very deliberate decision. This is an ironic thing for me to say, I suppose, but there's this part of us that sort of finds the end of the world appealing in some way. It's an opportunity to create dramatic stories. It's, Mad Max Fury Road. It's, it's this really cool car chase and, whatever. So we're attracted to these stories, and I certainly am attracted to these stories, whether they're Mad Max or written by, J.G. Ballard. And I was trying to think about why that is, because I don't really, want the world to end. I don't. So where did that attraction come from? And I thought about how End of the World stories worked. And then then I set that against what would really feel like the end of the world to me, which is, losing my family, which is what the main character in the story contends with. And it made me realize that, for somebody, their world is ending, even as we speak right now. Somewhere some tragedy is enveloping someone, and the world is going to be completely remade as a consequence, and it can happen at any time. And so the story was an attempt to sort of compare that, that idea that the world is always ending with the tropes of the end of the world story, and get down into the emotional, the emotional power that is latent, the terror that is latent in that personal apocalypse, rather than this science fictional apocalypse that we sort of enjoy.
I mean, the way that the story lays out these standard formulas that end of the world stories fall into kind of conveys the sense to me that you maybe feel that the end of the world story is played out or exhausted to some extent. Is that true?
I would have to think about that. I don't think that it's exhausted. What I was concerned about was the use of these tropes without any examination of the sort of moral consequences of these kinds of tropes. There is a section of the story, you may remember it, where it talks about, the first end of the world story is the Garden of Eden, right? Where Adam and Eve are thrown out of the story, or out of the garden into a world of death and suffering and pain and childbirth and what have you. And I was thinking about that as a kind of end of the world story, and that's a pretty terrifying story, when you think about it. And that led me to thinking about another end of the world story that I referenced in that particular story, which was these stories that depict the rapture, and all the good people are raptured into heaven and all the bad people are left, and I was thinking about how horrible that really is as a conceit. All the good people are going to be raptured to heaven. What about the good people who are flying planes, right? That doesn't seem fair to all the people on the plane who have to contend with that. So yeah, the story is as much about the horror of the real horror of the end of the world, whether personal or your home being destroyed in a tidal wave. I think that's what the story is about. Is this is a really horrible, terrible thing, and we tend to take it very lightly in fiction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in this other story you mentioned, the end of everything, sort of on a surface level, it's about the end of the world, but then it takes a turn and becomes, it seems to me, much more about art and what is the purpose of art, and at some level, what is the point of art? Is that something that you sort of wrestle with a lot? Like, what is the point of art?
It is something I wrestle with. I mean, we are storytelling creatures, and I think the stories we tell about ourselves and to one another are it's really important to think hard about what those stories are. If you tell yourself a certain kind of story, you wind up doing terrible things to other people, And I think that we really need to examine that carefully when we sit down to write a story or to make a movie or create some kind of fictional world. I think these things matter. And that sounds kind of pretentious. I don't want to, hang myself with the capital A art kind of label, but I just think it's really important to consider what are these stories that we tell ourselves doing to us? And, how do they affect us? And what choices do we make as creators, given the fact that they do influence us? I mean, the world is driven by stories. Christianity is a story, right? And it shapes the existence of millions of people. I think we should examine these stories.
But so you've never gone through a mind frame like the character in the story where he's feeling sort of like, what is the point of my writing career? Maybe I should give up, do something else. Have you ever been in a spot like that?
Oh, absolutely. Every day. You do wonder what it's about, as on a personal level. I have met writers who seem to enjoy the process in a way that I don't. And I think it would be easy to walk away, except it's impossible to walk away because you're kind of driven to do it. And the character in this story is, these are the issues he faces. And at the end of the story, he's a struggling poet who has never really achieved any kind of recognition. And he turns back in the face of truly the end of the world, knowing that everything is going to come crashing down around him. The world is going to come to an end. And he sits down and he starts to write a poem in spite of that. And, it's like, that Dylan Thomas poem about, standing tall against the dying of the light. I think that's what it's about.
I mean, one line from that story that really struck me is the character thinks to himself, what else was art to do if it didn't strip away our masks and expose us raw and naked to the world? Do you feel like that's what you do when you write fiction?
Yeah. Can I give you a one-word answer? I think that is. I mean, look, there are different ways of writing fiction, and I don't devalue any of them, okay? But for me, a story has to have some center. It has to have something to say. Now, whether I'm successful at that or not is up to others to judge. But there has to be something at the center of a story that is honest and raw. And if there is not, I don't find the story that satisfying as a reader. And I don't find it very satisfying to write those stories. Certainly I have. But I don't find them as interesting as a writer as I do the stories that are kind of risky. And, the end of everything was kind of a risky story for me. I felt like, I think it's about the insecurities of and the incredible arrogance of the act of writing and expecting people to be interested in it and grappling with that.
Do you ever have people comment on very private things that you've put in your work, or do people generally just kind of like not want to, just read the work and don't comment on it because they don't want to like touch that?
I mean, if you were reading something by me, I think, I mean, you may recognize something in it, but until this conversation we're having, we've never met, so you don't like recognize that raw part of myself that's in the story. I mean, you may sense it, but you don't recognize it, I think, as part of me. Does that make sense? But if my family reads it, then they they may see things that are perilous to see.
Right. Well, it seems like one of the nice things about fiction is that you can put in all this stuff that isn't true, and that gives you sort of the courage to put in the stuff that is true, because no one is ever really going to know what's true and what isn't.
Right. I think that's exactly right. And I mean, I think there are, I want to distinguish between truth and fact, and the fact that we all have our truths. And I think that, that's what I try to explore when I write, is what are my truths? What do I believe? What do I think about the world? And how people interact. I'm really much more interested in the people in my stories than in the stuff that's happening around them. It starts with character for me, and I think of Faulkner's Nobel Prize winning speech, I think it was, where he said the only reason to write is to write about the human heart in conflict with itself. And I think there's a lot of truth in that.
Well, I mean, speaking of characters, why don't you tell us about the characters in your new novel, In the Nightwood?
Well, my characters in my new novel are a college professor of English. So already you begin to see how close this cuts to the bone. And he is coping with his implicit responsibility at some level for the death of his child, and how that affects his relationship with his wife, and so that seems to be the engine that drives the story to me. Is again, it's a story of personal apocalypse. I was thinking, what is the worst thing that could happen to me? Because this is the kind of person I am, I guess. And I was thinking, my God, what if I lost my child? And what if somehow I was, at least partially responsible for the loss of that child? How do you live with that? How do you move forward from that? How does that affect your relationships with the people you love and who love you? And that was, in some sense, one of the points that the novel began, is that question of what is the worst thing that can happen to you? And the answer to me was losing your child. It sounds so cheery and uplifting, doesn't it?
Well, yeah. So, but why don't you tell us as well about just some of the other aspects of the story? So, this couple finds themselves residing in this country estate, and it's bound up with this book that the protagonist had encountered as a child.
Yeah, he's encountered this book, and he is as part of the general disaster that has overtaken his life. He's lost his job, and he is looking for a way to find a way to work usefully in a way. And he is fascinated by this fantasy novel, kind of a fairy tale that had been written in the 1840s, and he has the opportunity to go and study, to go to the home of this writer who wrote this fairy tale, years and years and years ago, more than a century ago, and perhaps do some research on him. And this is a way both to get away from the pain of his daughter's death, and he hopes in some way maybe to redeem himself in a small way. And what he finds, I think, what he finds is that the world of the fantasy that he is reading about in this book is bleeding into the world around him. So the book, at some level, is about the eruption of, the transcendent world, the supernatural world into the mundane world, and the story is sort of I think poised on the knife edge of trying to sort out what's real and what's not. I think that's the question he has to deal with as he tries to untangle the interconnections between the historical record of this writer and the work that the writer did, this book that he's produced called In the Nightwood.
One thing that struck me in the acknowledgments is that you say that Barry Malzberg read drafts of this and provided advice. And I was just curious how you know him and what he had to say about the book.
Barry is a longtime friend, acquaintance friend. He wrote me a letter out of the blue, not long after I started publishing, about a story called Touched, which I had just written and published in fantasy and science fiction. And he wrote me to tell me how much he liked it, and that was very flattering to me because, of course, I had been reading Barry. He was one of those writers in the public library that I was sort of going through, and it was like having one of your one of the people you really looked up to reach down and say that what you're doing is worthwhile. And Barry has read some drafts of things along the way, and he read this, and he was, he was concerned about the darkness of the book, which is funny in a way, because Barry's fiction is very dark, but he was concerned that perhaps these characters would not be sympathetic enough to a reader, and I don't know whether he was right or not. I went forward with it, and it is, out in the world, and I guess people can make their own decisions about it. But Barry's friendship has meant a lot, and that letter really meant a lot. It was validating. I had a similar experience with Robert Silverberg, who emailed me out of the blue to ask if he could reprint a story of mine called The Rain at the End of the World, which was another apocalypse story, now that I think about it. And just, opening my email and seeing Robert Silverberg there, it was a stunning moment. And that was a powerful moment in my life. What was really interesting is, what was even more powerful in a way is that he emailed me again the next day and said, I actually like this other story too, so I'd like to reprint it as well. And that was The End of the World as we know it. And so there are those little moments where, the people you have looked up to for years reach out, and they're very gratifying. So that's how I came to know Barry, and with a little Robert Silverberg thrown in.
Well, and another person who was involved in this book was John Joseph Adams, who was the editor, and he'll be well known to listeners of this podcast. Could you just sort of say what it was like working with him?
Working with John is great. I mean, I had worked with John some when he was a first reader of fantasy and science fiction, where I was publishing a lot of short fiction. And then, he went out on his own and started doing anthologies, and he reprinted some of my work in those anthologies, and then he started Nightmare and Lightspeed, and I ended up selling stories to him there. So by the time, he looked at the book, we were pretty well acquainted. So it was a very comfortable relationship because we had worked together so frequently before. And, his contribution to the book was pretty significant. He enabled me to see some things that I hadn't seen, and he pushed me in places where I had taken the easy way out, and I think that's what a good editor does, and I think John's a great editor.
Well, it says in the acknowledgments too, you say, I was lost for a long time on this book. How long were you working on it?
I started working on it. The genesis of the book came from 2 points. One point was the question that I already mentioned about how do you cope with the death of a child. And the other point was the fantasy conceit of the book, which is this forest that surrounds the estate, which is kind of bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, if that makes sense. You go into it and you go into a different place, different, kind of reality almost. And that dimension of the book occurred to me on the drive back from the World Fantasy Convention in 2003. It was in Washington, D.C., I think. And there was a long section of Interstate 85 where there was nothing, right? There were just trees as far as you could see on both sides of the road. And it's like no one lived in that place for, 70 miles or so. And I was with my friend Jack Slay, with whom I collaborated on another novel. And I think I said to Jack, I feel like the trees go on forever. And so it was that fantasy conceit, this huge forest, that then became a way to bring this story about a father who has lost his child into focus, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, have you gotten any responses on the book from readers or reviewers or anything?
I have. It's the great temptation as a writer is to read reviews. And, you read the good ones and you think, well, I did well. And then you read somebody who didn't like the book. And if you accept the I did well, you're sort of honor bound to accept the reader who didn't like the book. But so I take reviews with some, with a grain of salt. But the response to this book has been generally positive, and therefore I give them credence.
So how
go ahead.
Oh, well, you said you were concerned that people would think the couple was not sympathetic enough or the book was too dark. How have people reacted to that?
There have been people that reacted to the story that way, and that's a legitimate reaction. You put the book out there, and people get to make their own decisions about it. That's the nature of the business, I think. But there have been readers who have found the characters too unsympathetic, perhaps, too tortured, and if that's the way they find the book, they're certainly well within their rights to respond to it. It's their book now. It's not mine. And there have been, and there have been very positive reactions. So I don't know quite how to respond, except I will say this. As a writer, you sometimes hear this notion that characters must be likable and sympathetic. And I don't really buy that. Although I find Charles, the main character, and his wife Erin in the novel, both to be likable and sympathetic people. They're just deeply flawed and people in pain, and people who have made mistakes. But that's how I see them. But I don't subscribe to the idea that characters have to be sympathetic. I think characters have to be interesting and true. And that's what drives the work of fiction for me when I read.
I just think it's funny because, I don't know Barry Malzberg well, but just by reputation, I know of him as being a sort of morose person who writes very dark fiction. And so just to have him say, like, well, this book is kind of too dark, obviously it's a book that will appeal to people who like dark stories.
I think, Barry is a multidimensional guy, and as I think his inclinations, his sort of view of the world is a dark view, but he also, he worked for years as a first reader at the Scott Meredith Literary Agency, so he has a finely honed sense of what makes a book commercial, I think, as well. And I think he was worried about that dimension of it, not it's too dark and that it doesn't, reflect reality or whatever. But it may be too dark to find the readership that he would want it to find. And, I hope he's wrong.
Well, if everyone listening to this goes out and buys a copy, then, it'll all turn out for the best. It'll all turn out happily ever
please. After. By all means.
All right. So, Dale, we're pretty much out of time. So do you have just any final thoughts, or do you have any other projects you want to mention?
I do have a series of short stories, which I think are a lot of fun, and which I'm taking these titles of old science fiction and fantasy movies from the 50s and trying to write emotionally serious stories around these titles. Like I Married a Monster from Outer Space. To take that conceit literally and then do something interesting with it in an emotional sense. And so I'm working on those, and those are the main things I have going in terms of short fiction. And I have novels that I'm working on as well, but let's go with the tea kettle theory on those.
So where would people find those stories, the short stories you mentioned?
They have been in Clark's World. There was one about the creature from the Black Lagoon in Clark's World. And there was one called Teenagers from Outer Space in Clark's World. John published one called The Horror of Party Beach just last month. Sheila Williams at Asimov's has published a couple of them. She published I Married a Monster from Outer Space and Invasion of the Saucer Men. And so those are the main markets that have picked them up to this point.
Yeah, all right. Well, that sounds great, and everyone definitely go check all that out. And so we've been speaking with Dale Bailey about his books In the Night Wood and The End of Everything. So, Dale, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Dale Bailey for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Kai Wood, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.